Okay then. It appears that we are recording, and therefore I should probably start doing this Q&A video. So welcome to question and answer number 135, which is a relatively high number. I am your host, pannobhasa, and this is my beverage. So I shall remove the little paper umbrella, lick the coffee off of it so I won't get coffee on my sweetheart's desk. Take a sip of said beverage. Kind of rearrange my beard a little bit so it looks almost symmetrical. And I suppose I should just commence to answering questions after I do some introductory digression about something or other. And I might as well mention that I still do have a cold. You may recall if you watched the previous Q&A that I was just coming down with the cold. Well, I'm just now getting over it. So it's fading out, inshallah. So probably by next week, I'll be perfectly healthy aside from the various little sores and stuff that everybody has. In Buddhism, I think the Buddha called the human body the heap of sores. I assume in ancient India, people had more sores than nowadays, on average. So anyways, we don't have a whole heck of a lot of questions. This should easily be finished in less than 3 hours, so no worries on that score. And I suppose I should just wade right into this. And before I answer any questions, however, I will have to read one of the questions. And this is from Bodhisattva 969. And Bodhisattva 969 said, I recently came across a video on YouTube by Varapanyo. Is it not forbidden for a bhikkhu to ask for donations in the form of money or to make it possible to donate money to the bhikkhu himself? Well, for starters, I'm not sure which Varapanyo he's referring to. There are a number of Varapanyos. I know of at least 2 Western Varapanyos. I think one of them may have disrobed recently, though. But still, I'm not exactly sure which Varapanyo he's referring to. But fortunately for everybody, it doesn't even matter which Varapanyo, because the question is with regard to a monk asking for monetary donations. And of course, it is strictly prohibited for monks to ask for monetary donations to themselves or to anybody. A monk is not supposed to tell anybody what to do with money. So if somebody, like a layperson, asks a monk, what should I do with this money? According to the texts, the monk is allowed to say, do whatever makes you happy. But monks aren't allowed to accept money. So this is, most monks do handle money. And maybe that even most Theravada Buddhist bhikkhus will ask for donations, at least to the monastery, which is still forbidden. But still, like in Burma, approximately 98% of all monks handle money, even though it is strictly prohibited. In Thailand, it might be as low as 95%. I'm not an expert on Thai Buddhism, but it might be slightly less in Thailand, simply because Thailand or Thai Buddhism has a little bit more respect for Vinaya than Burmese Buddhism. With regard to Sri Lanka, I have no idea, but I doubt that they're any better than the Burmese. And with regard to Western monks, it may be that as many as half of Western monks don't handle money. Simply because they're going against the grain. They have to go against their own culture in order to become a monk. So they tend to be more serious about what they're doing on average. Although, of course, there are extremely serious Asian monks. So I'm not saying that all Asian monks are not serious. So getting back to the money issue, technically, I've already answered the question, I guess. It's just completely prohibited to tell a layperson or to suggest to a layperson that they should do anything with money other than just whatever makes them happy. And if a monk does ask for money and gets it, or he gets money even without asking for it, that's a Nisagiya Pachidya offense. He's not allowed to even confess the offense effectively until he has first gotten rid of all the money, which most monks don't do. And so most monks do not have pure sila at any time during their monkhood. because they are unwilling to get rid of the money and whatever else is against the rules that they own in order to make the confession, which they can't really make until they get rid of the stuff. That's what Nisagia Pachidia means. There's two different kinds of Pachidia rules in the Patimokkha. This regular Pachidia would be like killing an animal, telling an ordinary lie, sleeping under the same roof as a woman, that kind of thing, where all you got to do is just make the confession. But Nisagia Pachidia, which includes money, for example, you've got to get rid of whatever it is that's against the rules before you can make the confession, because if you confess having money while still having it, I mean, you're breaking the rule while making the confession, and you're breaking the rule immediately after making the confession. So, I mean, you've never really like gotten rid of the offense. You have not expiated the offense yet. So let's see. Is it not forbidden for a bhikkhu to ask for donations in the form of money, or to make it possible to donate money to the bhikkhu himself? Yeah, there's even limitations on like asking for donations that aren't money. Like, for example, if a monk says, okay, I'll give a Dhamma talk at your Dhamma center if you will help us build this retaining wall that we need. That's out too. It's sort of offering Dhamma in exchange for some kind of payment. Even if it's not money, it's still against the rules. But getting back to Bodhisattva 969's question, yes, it is always forbidden for monks to ask for monetary donations for themselves or for the Sangha in general, for the upkeep of the monastery, for anything. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, do you believe any of the Greek philosophers may have been enlightened? And then he says, some points of interest. The Buddha and Heraclitus are noted as having similar views on how reality operates. I've seen people argue that Pyrrho of Elis was a Buddhist and that his idea of ataraxia is the same as nirvana. Diogenes' no fucks given attitude and embrace of poverty shows a lack of attachment to worldly affairs. Stoicism and Buddhism have a lot in common. If you Google Seneca quotes, for example, they sound very Buddhist. I'm sure there are many more parallels to be drawn. Well, philosophy, literally means the love of wisdom. And so for philosophers, especially ancient Greek philosophers, to say wise things or to have wise behavior shouldn't be all that outrageous or remarkable, because they were trying to cultivate wisdom as a general rule. With regard to any of the philosophers that he mentioned, I don't know if any of them were enlightened. I don't know if there's any way of knowing if any of them were enlightened. I kind of have my doubts about Heraclitus. He seems to be kind of a prickly kind of guy from what little I know of him. With regard to Pyrrho, the founder of skepticism, again, I kind of doubt that I think he was more like intellectual in his skepticism and not really a mystic, which is what the Buddha was. People can call the Buddha a skeptic for saying don't believe anything, but he wasn't really a skeptic. He just realized that reality cannot be known by thinking about it. Now, beliefs do not capture the truth. With regard to Diogenes, I don't think he was fully enlightened. I don't think Socrates was fully enlightened, although he was wise. He apparently kind of liked boys still and drank a lot, but I won't hold that against him necessarily. With regard to ancient philosophers ancient Western philosophers that had some claim to great wisdom, the one that was most famous in ancient times, even though technically he was more of a Roman citizen than anything else, what was it? I was thinking it just the other day, or Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius of Tyana was sort of like the pagan Jesus. And he just didn't really catch enough traction, and Jesus wound up winning the popularity contest in ancient times. Another ancient philosopher who may have had some really profound spiritual attainments would be Plotinus. I guess, what was his name? Empedocles, the one that threw himself into the volcano. I mean, he was sort of a spiritual teacher in addition to being a philosopher. So, I mean, it was like in Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, he refers to Empedocles as a kind of ancient Mary Baker Eddy, and combined with a few other things. Let's see, Parmenides, I think, might have had some deep insights. Let's see, who else? There was one other one I was thinking of. Oh yeah, Pythagoras. I mean, Pythagoras taught like rebirth, and he had some spirituality in addition to just the cerebral intellectuality that is sort of like stereotypical of Western philosophy. But you can't really know. It's impossible to know. You don't know how accurate the accounts are of their lives and of what they said and so forth. You can't really know this stuff. It's all just kind of academic. So let's getting back up to the question. Do you believe any of the Greek philosophers may have been enlightened? Maybe. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, but I don't know for sure. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Zenithoid. Can you give a Buddhist perspective on the significance and meaning of Diogenes telling Alexander to step out of his sunlight? And I mean, it's one of the most well-known stories of Diogenes the Cynic. I think he was a slave at the time. He had been like kidnapped off of a ship by pirates and sold as a slave. And so he was like the tutor to the children of this rich guy, but he was still famous. I've read that after Alexander the Great, he was the most famous Greek of his time, like at the time. And so anyways, Alexander the Great, he liked hanging out with philosophers, kind of like ancient Indian kings in the Buddhist time apparently liked hanging out with philosophers. And so Alexander went to find out about this Diogenes fellow that he'd heard so much about. And he has like a conversation with Diogenes, who is lying in the sun like a dog, just kind of, lying in a sunny place, warming up his body. He doesn't bother to get up to talk to Alexander. And so Alexander's very impressed by the wisdom of Diogenes. And at the end, he asks him, is there anything I can get for you? He's like the most powerful man in the world, practically. Whatever you want. What is it? And Diogenes just says, yeah, could you move over? You're blocking my sunlight. And the Buddhist perspective on that, I mean, I don't know how Buddhist it would be. I don't think the Buddha would have asked Alexander or, King Pasenadi Kosala to get out of his light. I mean, even that is a desire. It's kind of a small desire. But, I mean, in a way, it was Diogenes was just kind of showing off that he didn't have any desire for any of the stuff that a king could give him, really. But whether it would be something the Buddha would say, simply because even just the desire to get somebody out of your sunlight, I mean, still, that's like a minor desire or craving or attachment or whatever. So I guess I answered that one pretty much, more or less. Sort of. So I'm just going to move on to Zenithoid's third question here. He's in a Greek vein on this one. He says, are there any parallel stories to that of Diogenes and Alexander to be found in Buddhist or Hindu history? Well, like I already mentioned, there's a lot of stories of kings, powerful kings and generals going and hanging out with the famous philosophers of the day, including the Buddha, asking them questions, kind of comparing what this philosopher told him with what that philosopher told him, that sort of thing. Although I don't know if there's any kind of real parallel with the Buddha lying on the ground and some king blocking his sunlight, and then the Buddha remarking on the fact that the king was blocking his sunlight. So Yeah, there's lots and lots of stories of, illustrious kings and so forth going and talking to wise men, just because they're interested in that sort of thing, I guess. But I don't think there's any like close parallel to the story of Diogenes and Alexander. Not that I know of. It might be in some Hindu Purana or something, but I don't know what it would be. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, at the start of your videos these days, you say, welcome to Q&A X, and X is a relatively high number, but isn't every number relatively high as well as relatively low? Well, I mean, how is 0 going to be a relatively high number? How is 1 going to be a relatively high number? Right? How is 936 octillion going to be a relatively low number? Doesn't work that way. But I'm just in the habit of remarking on relatively high numbers. It's something I started at work a few years ago. Somebody's, they've got to make like 22 roofing panels or something. I said, that's a relatively high number, just for the hell of it, just to move the air around. So I just say it. Okay? You okay with that? But really, every Q&A number that I do, it is a relatively high number after about 1. Because, compared with all the other Q&A numbers, the most recent one is always the highest number. So relative to all the other Q&A numbers, it's always the highest one. It's never the lowest one. I'm never going to come out with Q&A number 0, which is going to be lower than all the other ones. It's just not going to happen. So, I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' next question, which is as follows. If you teach someone everything wrong about spirituality, kind of like Wimp Lo from Kung Pao Enter the Fist, except the spirituality version. Okay, and then he goes on to become a teacher, is it possible that he could become a great teacher after all? So you teach everything wrong to somebody, you just mess up, you give them the 3 noble truths. Right? It's like the 19 factors of enlightenment and all this. And then they take that to heart, and then they become teachers and then become famous. Well, they could become a great teacher in the sense of becoming like a famous, successful teacher, even though they're teaching wrong stuff from a Buddhist point of view. Excuse me. So, they could be that kind of a great teacher, or they could just somehow make progress despite the bad teaching with regard to philosophical stuff in their meditation. They can just, when you're meditating, you're not thinking philosophical stuff anyway, or at least you shouldn't be. Not when you get into a deep level of meditation, you shouldn't be thinking anything really. So it may be that in spite of the bad teaching, that he was able to have some kind of deep spiritual awakening experience that he can then like teach to others. And so even though a lot of the theory might be wrong, still, he's teaching from experience with regard to something that, he has attained. So he could be a great teacher in that sense. And that happens a lot. A lot of the teachings of Theravada Buddhism, some of them, let's say, are just factually incorrect. Same, with any religion, like Roman Catholicism. I've said many times that St. John of the Cross may have been fully enlightened despite this, essentially, from a Buddhist point of view, an unenlightened point of view, just wrong view. There's belief in a, eternal God Almighty, a personal God. There's belief in an immortal soul, all this stuff about Mary being a virgin and Jesus dying for our sins and all this that is just irrelevant to Dhamma. It's not necessary to know this from a Buddhist point of view. Still, the Christians put a lot of emphasis on that. And to a large degree, in spite of the teachings of his tradition, he was able to get very profound attainments. He was a master of 4th jhana, in my opinion. At least it appears that way. So, yeah, there's 2 ways you could become a great teacher, even though you were taught your philosophy all wrong. One is you just become like a famous and successful charlatan. And 2 is you are able to practice correctly, even though the theory was mistaken, and sort of transcend the mistaken theory through just getting deep attainments in spite of that mistaken, incorrect theory. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, according to Plato, the democratic man or the democratic subject refuses to believe that some pleasures are honorable and some base, and is utterly unable to concentrate on any one thing. Now he's doing this, now that, and so on. When he's motivated, he's full of zeal for whatever has now struck his fancy, but it never lasts. Other times he's lazy and nihilistic, but at all times he is distracted. What do you think of this characterization? And the source is Plato's Republic, 561c to 562a. Well, I don't think it's necessarily true. It could just be like a broad generalization that Plato was just observing the behavior of Athenians in particular, maybe a few other like democratic city-states in ancient Greece. But like, for example, the early USA, the founding fathers of the United States, I don't think that they refused to believe that some pleasures are honorable and some base. I mean, Americans believe that some pleasures are honorable and some pleasures are base up until relatively recently, up until cultural Marxism just kind of undermined the whole foundation of ethics and just replaced it with unrefined feminine sentiment. So, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily true at all. I don't think it really applies to America very well. It might have applied to ancient Athens for all I know, but I don't recall ever being in ancient Athens, so I can't really say for sure. So let's see. Utterly unable to concentrate on any one thing. I mean, I don't think that's true. It could be just sort of a tendency in that direction, more so than certain other political systems, like, Spartan fascism or something. Not that Spartans were really fascist, but kind of. They were relatively fascistic compared with the Athenians anyhow. So, yeah, I mean, every political system is going to have its good points and its bad points. Everything has got its good side and its bad side. You can find negative aspects to anything that's got positive aspects. So, let's see. What do I think of the characterization? I think that it might be a slight tendency. It might apply to people living in democracies more than people living in authoritarian dictatorships, for example. But still, it seems empirically false if I compare this characterization with the United States for the first 150 years of its existence. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, what's your thoughts on Venerable Kondanya? And it's kind of strange that Venerable Kondanya gets so little press. Most Buddhists probably don't know who Venerable Kondanya was. But he was one of the group of 5 ascetics that were the first converts to Buddhism. And sometimes you'll see like a picture of the Buddha like out in the forest giving a speech to like 5 ascetics. That's symbolic of the first sermon. Sometimes he's even got his hands kind of like this. As he's counting off the 4 Noble Truths for the first time. And sometimes if it shows these 5 ascetics, it'll show one of them older than the rest. One of them may have white hair when the rest of them have black hair. The older one is Kondanya. And sometimes he was called Anyata Kondanya, which means he has understood. And that's because Venerable Kondanya was the first disciple of the Buddha who became an Arya. At the first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in which the Buddha started Buddhism, that Kondanya I think he became a Sotapanna, according to tradition, during the first sermon. And then the Buddha said, I don't remember the exact statement, but he's essentially Kondanya has understood. He could see that Kondanya had some like awakening insight. And so Anyata Kondanya or Anya Kondanya became sort of like his nickname. And then he was, if not the very first enlightened disciple, then, he has the reputation for also being the first Buddhist monk to become fully enlightened under the Buddha's dispensation during the second discourse of the Buddha, which is the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, or the discourse on the mark of no self. So Kondanya was like the first Buddhist convert to get like Arya attainment, and also probably the first to become fully enlightened, to become an arhat. And he died long before the Buddha. He was considerably older than the Buddha. And so he just kind of disappears from the scene relatively early on in the history of, the biography of the Buddha and his teachings. Kondanya, he was famous for being one of the group of five, the first enlightened disciple, and then he just kind of disappears. There's lots of legends about him, but probably they're more mythology than history. But I've got nothing against Venerable Kondanya. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question after paying respects to Venerable Kondanya. And this is from Quasitor. And Quasitor says, if the senses each have consciousness and Nibbana is beyond the senses, how is there consciousness in Nibbana? Well, you're getting into sort of a controversial, sticky philosophical point in Theravada Buddhism. According to Theravada Buddhism, you can't have consciousness without consciousness of something. Whereas Nibbana, according to a few very ancient fragments that you can find in the suttas that eventually became unorthodox and had to be reinterpreted, but Nibbana would be consciousness without an object. It would just be infinite formless consciousness. Unmanifest, luminous all around. And so, it's not sense consciousness. It's not vijnana khandha. It's not the aggregate of consciousness that's in the five khandhas that form a sentient being. It's just kind of consciousness that has just utterly become unfettered. No more conditions, no more limitations, and that causes it to just go off the scale. That anything that is formless and infinite, it's just off the scale. There's no way of really identifying it, singling it out, perceiving it. So let's read the question again. Quasitor asks, if the senses each have consciousness and Nibbana is beyond the senses, how is there consciousness in Nibbana? Well, the senses don't create the consciousness. You can have each sense has its own sensitivity. You've got nose sensitivity and tongue sensitivity, eye sensitivity, ear sensitivity, body, tactile sensitivity, and also mind, thought sensitivity. The sixth sense in Buddhism is the mind, with mental states being called Dhamma, which is kind of confusing because Dhamma has so many different meanings. There would be consciousness in Nibbana, but you can say that there's consciousness in Nibbana, but when something becomes infinite and formless, it just goes off the scale. It's no longer samsaric. It's no longer anything identifiable in samsara. It's something that cannot be perceived. So it's just when consciousness frees itself from sense organs and sensory systems, it just goes off the scale. It becomes so free that it becomes free of phenomenal existence. And so whether it really exists or not, itself just becomes this kind of a dopey kind of a question, which people ask all the time anyway. No offense to Quasitor. So I'm just going to move on to Quasitor's second question. If a meditator develops wisdom to the extent that their base experience of reality is so subtle that they slip into jhana regularly without trying, can their base reality ever regress back to a gross reality in this or future lives, or will their wisdom prevent that from happening? Well, until you become an Arya, you can always backslide. Like in the Godika Sutta, Godika gets jhana, then he loses it, then he gets it, then he loses it, then he gets it, then he loses it, until finally he's in a state of desperation. And he thinks, if I die with jhana, I'm guaranteed a Brahma heaven realm. But if I don't have jhana when I die, there's no guarantees. And so he decides to auto-terminate. But, even the Brahmas, you have jhana, you master jhana, you wind up in a Brahma realm, you stay in this Brahma realm for billions of years, let's say, and then you exhaust your karma. You just get reborn somewhere else. It's like spiritual advancement is not like this one-way ratchet thing. A lot of people have this idea, just evolution in general. Even with regard to organic evolution, things aren't necessarily going from simple to complex or from lower to higher. That some creatures, they simplify and become more primitive in form as a way of adaptation. Like a flea, the ancestors of fleas had wings. Fleas lost their wings. It's just that the flea wings got in the way when they decided to just stay on the dog instead of flying from one dog to the other dog. So it's the same way with evolution, or like spiritual evolution. You can call it evolution in a way, but still, it's not just one way. You can go from lower realms to upper realms and from upper realms to lower realms. And there's no guarantee until, according to Orthodox tradition, once you become a Sotapanna, once you become an Arya, then you're kind of locked on target and there's no backsliding anymore. But some early Buddhists even thought that an Arahant could backslide, that you could become enlightened and then become unenlightened again. That was one of the first philosophical controversies that resulted in the first big schism, or so I have read. So, let's see. If their experience of reality is so subtle that they slip into jhana regularly without trying, I'm not exactly sure if that would be like complete mastery of jhana. Like St. John of the Cross, I've already brought him up. I bring him up all the time. He talked about the 3 stages of spiritual development, which is very similar to a certain Buddhist scheme, not the 4 stages of Aryahood, but the Putujana, or the common person. And then you've got the Seika, the person in training who has gotten like Arya attainment but hasn't become fully enlightened yet. And then you've got the Aseka, one no longer in training, that is fully enlightened. According to St. John of the Cross, you had a similar 3 stages. You had the common person, the beginner. He called him the beginner. Then you have the adept, and the adept is someone who can get jhana whenever they want. They can experience high contemplation, as the Catholics call it. And then after the adept comes the perfect, and that is the person who has completely, they have overcome their self-will. They have mortified their self-will. They no longer have any self-will. So they're just like an empty vessel that acts in accordance with the will of God. So, according to St. John of the Cross, the reason why I brought this up is that he mentions the kind of person that can, they can get attainment, or they can contemplate, they can get into contemplative states, and then they lose it. And then they get into contemplative states again, and then they lose it. And then they get into contemplative states again, and they lose it. And I was like that as a monk for several years. And St. John of the Cross said this thing that kind of haunted me. It was like, well, if you keep losing it, you can't consistently master it. You can't just completely lock it down and be a master of it for the rest of your life. Then God just has other plans for you. In my case, forklift operator. So I guess, if you mastered it, like if you became what St. John of the Cross called an adept, where you were just locked in, for the rest of your life, you're solid. You can just get jhana whenever you want it. Then all that does is it guarantees that you wind up in a Brahma realm, and you may just squander your wisdom just delighting in bliss as a Brahma, and then wind up born again as a human with no recollection at all of having been a meditation master because you burned up all of your karma along those lines, or you burned up so much of it that you're back being a regular, like a meat puppet, like an upgraded ape. So evolution isn't necessarily just one way. And I hope I answered that question because I'm moving on to Quasitor's third one. And Quasitor's third question is, I'm going to make sure we are recording here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We've been going for more than half an hour already. Quasitor's third question is, can the universe reset and all the arahants go back to samsara, losing all wisdom, or does wisdom transcend all other forces? Well, personally, I kind of go along with a more Einsteinian conception of time and a less Newtonian conception of time. I would agree with the Sarvastivada Buddhists more than with the Theravada Buddhists on that score, in which case, I mean, if the past still exists, then even if you become enlightened now, that past, that unenlightened past, is eternal in a sense. It just doesn't go away. It's still there, even though it's in the past. So, I mean, that would apply to any enlightened being, that it's all still there. And also going with my theory of everything, like the simile of the block of marble. The block of marble contains every single possible statue. Every single possible unenlightened version of you is always forever and ever going to stay in that statue because it can. So the thing is, when you become enlightened, you realize that you never really existed to begin with. Not like you didn't really exist as having like this self-existent individuality. You know, it was all virtual. It was all conditional. And that conditionality stays, and the unenlightened beings, I mean, they don't really exist to begin with. So nothing fundamentally changes. All the unenlightened statues in that block of marble remain there forever and ever. No Mahayana Buddhist is ever going to liberate all beings. There's always going to be an infinite number of unenlightened beings existing virtually and conditionally in the uncarved block of marble. The nameless uncarved block, as the Tao Te Ching puts it. So, with regard to the universe resetting and all the arahants going back to samsara, no, it wouldn't work that way. Except just with like time as the fourth dimension, or time as a fourth dimension, the past just doesn't poof out of existence like it does in orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy, like in Abhidhamma and the commentarial tradition. According to Abhidhamma, the only moment that exists is the present moment, which is constantly changing. But I think I'm a little more Einsteinian in my understanding of how time works. But you can take your pick on that one. But it's not that the universe resets. That's just, I mean, time is cyclical, which is something, it's in a question farther down. So I'll get to that when the question comes. So, I mean, in Buddhism, time is kind of cyclical, but it doesn't just, I mean, it's not just like this tape that you play it and then you just reset to the beginning, like a YouTube short. When you get to the end of it, it just starts at the beginning again. It's not like that. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, is Dhamma understood as the law of nature, dependent origination and emptiness, an objective reality that exists independently of experience? The Buddha is said to have discovered Dhamma, yet Madhyamaka philosophy teaches that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence and arise only dependently. If no conscious beings exist, does Dhamma still exist, or is it merely a designation that depends on perception? Yeah, it's a designation that depends on perception. I mean, if there's no perceiving mind that's perceiving Dhamma, then Dhamma is kind of has a potential, but I mean, it's not ultimately real. It's still just sort of like, it's like thought images and so forth. So I mean, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Even that, I mean, it doesn't exist in Plato's heaven, independent of anybody perceiving it. I mean, it comes up when it's perceived, and then it just sort of poofs out of existence if no one's perceiving it. So the law of nature, dependent origination, emptiness, it's sort of like the philosophy of Kant, like the categories of Kant. Kant, I mean, he didn't even try to touch ultimate reality. He didn't even try to touch the thing in itself. He figured that was impossible. So what he did is he tried to like describe, explain, understand how human delusion works. And so how human delusion works is kind of what Dhamma is all about, how to transcend the delusion. So it's definitely a kind of perceptual thing. It's a raft made of rubbish. So yeah, it's let's see, where's the actual question mark here? Is it an objective reality that exists independently of experience? I would say no. And then let's see, there's another question mark here. If no conscious beings exist, does Dhamma still? Well, no conscious beings really do exist. See, that's the thing. Does Dhamma still exist? I mean, yeah, I mean, if no conscious beings exist, that should answer the question right there. There is no self in early Buddhism. Later kinds of Buddhism cooked up a self, but early Buddhism, there is no self. So, if no conscious beings exist, which is the case, does Dhamma still exist? No, I mean, it's pretty much like Madhyamaka philosophy says. It's like a mental construct. It is a raft made of rubbish, as the early, like, what is it, the Alagad-upama Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya says. You know, that rubbish is not some kind of eternal, you know, golden super reality. It's rubbish that you tie together to make a raft so you can cross the flood, and then you throw it away. You don't need the raft anymore. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's second question. Does nirvana exist outside of human experience? In Theravada Buddhism, nirvana is described as unconditioned, meaning it is not dependent on causes and conditions like samsaric existence. Some interpretations suggest that nirvana is a real transcendent state that exists independently of perception. However, Nagarjuna rejects the idea of nirvana as an independent absolute reality. He states that nirvana and samsara are not two separate things. They are both empty and arise only in relation to dependent origination. Nirvana is not a place or a thing outside of experience, but rather the cessation of clinging and ignorance, a realization rather than an independent state. Well, when Nagarjuna says that nirvana and samsara are not two separate things, they're both empty and arise only in relation to dependent origination, I mean, he's referring to the idea of nirvana. So obviously the idea of nirvana and the idea of samsara, they're both worldly phenomena. And that's all the unenlightened person can really do with regard to nirvana, is just think about it in samsaric thoughts, which don't touch it. Just like, I mean, the Kantian thing in itself, I mean, no amount of thinking is going to come anywhere near that. I mean, it just cannot and will not touch it. So, I mean, you can say that nirvana is a reality. Nirvana as a metaphysical state is ultimate reality. And it's just off the scale. I mean, it's some people, I mean, they just absolutely have to like grasp something intellectually, and they're just fucked. It's not going to work. You cannot grasp reality intellectually. All you can grasp is delusion. So, I mean, you're never going to understand nirvana by thinking about it. You're never going to understand reality by thinking about it. All this kind of stuff is a kind of intellectual masturbation in a way. Or it's just like a way of, you know, it's just more samsara. So you can say that nirvana as a metaphysical state is ultimate reality. And it's like the Kantian thing in itself. No amount of thinking or perception or philosophizing or anything like that is going to get anywhere near it. And then when you're calling it an it and trying to describe it, then it's just like Nagarjuna says, where it's empty. It is void. Then again, you've got nirvana as like the spiritual state or like the ethical state. It's like the moment of attainment. And see, where is he? The cessation of clinging and ignorance, a realization. But even that is not ultimately real. I mean, Nagarjuna could just nuke that out of existence too. So, I mean, you've got samsara, which is the context in which we are functioning right now, which is just not ultimately real. It is conditionally, provisionally, virtually real, but it doesn't have any inherent, like, self-essence. You know, it's just empty. It's just like, what do you call it? Dependent co-arising, just all these dependently co-arising conditions, just conditioning each other with no real solid foundation. But it's so hard to explain. I mean, no amount of explanation is going to explain it. And so, I mean, you have no choice but to indulge in like self-contradictions and so forth, just because you're trying to explain what is impossible to explain. So, I guess I should just move on to the next question. This is from Siovach and Sipad Zidana. And Siovach and Sipad Zidana says, how was Jainism able to survive in India after all this time, while Buddhism died out there and the other traditions in India did the same or evolved to become almost unrecognizable? So why did Jainism survive in India, whereas other like non-Vedic traditions like Buddhism and Ajivakism did not survive? I think Jainism survived for two main reasons. One is that the Jains were like radical ascetics that weren't like basing their centers in cities and so forth. You know, they didn't depend on these vast universities like Nalanda, for example. And I mean, they were just like more radical in their austerity than the Buddhists. And so they were more likely to be out in the woods. And also, Jainism was always kind of a small fish. Buddhism, when the Muslims invaded and just started genociding the Buddhists, Buddhism was like the predominant spiritual system. And so that was really obvious. And the Muslims just decided to wage war against it. Whereas the Jains, I mean, they were just sort of inconsequential. They were just kind of just like this insignificant minority that the Muslims didn't bother with because they had bigger fish to fry called Buddhists. So I assume those are like the two main reasons why Ajivakism died out, whereas Jainism didn't. I mean, I'm not exactly sure about that. If you read Basham's book about the Ajivakas, it's just sort of like a history of the Ajivakas. The Ajivakas just kind of, their religion sort of evolved more into like a devotionalistic cult. And then it just kind of lost touch with like empirical reality. I think people just couldn't relate to it as much anymore. And people are just going crazy on the Discord server. And I keep getting like these little pop-up windows and these little boop, boop, boop on this computer from just people going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth on the Discord server. And it's kind of distracting me a little bit. I should put like a moratorium on Discord when I'm doing these Q&As. But I'll just put their names on a list. That'll do for now, I guess. So I think I'll just move on to Siovach and Sipad Zidana's second question, which is, where would you realistically go to make friends and meet people as an adult? If you don't care about that, just take it as a hypothetical. Well, for me, realistically, the main place where I meet people and make friends is at work. Go to work, there's people there, and even if I keep to myself and don't talk much, there's always like sociable, friendly people that come up to me and start talking, and we wind up making friends and, you know, eat lunch and, I don't know, sit there, talk to each other, make jokes, that kind of thing. Aside from that, Where would you meet people as an adult? I mean, me personally, if I could find like a Dhamma center or something, not that I have any intention of doing so, but just like go to a meditation group. If you can find one that isn't just crazy leftist at this point, and meet lots of nice girls there, I suppose. Like go to a health club. I mean, you'll meet superficial people there for the most part, but people that are just kind of looks mogging or looks maxing. So, aside from that, I mean, unless you just really like make a point of just like walking up to people and making friends. I mean, if you do that, then the grocery store works, the laundromat works, going out to a club works. But I mean, I was never really that way. I never would go out. I was never particularly a sociable person. I've always been kind of a loner, and I was fine with that. I mean, that was just in accordance with my nature. I've never really wanted to go out and make friends. Go back to school. You meet lots of people in school. Just get a degree. Go to a community college. Get some degree in something, and meet lots of people there. You don't have any choice, really. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really the best person to consult with regard to how to go out and make friends, because it really has never been much of a priority. Like, since I have lived in South Carolina, I have invited like 2 friends from work, over to our house, and they brought their wives, and that was it. I mean, that's it's been several months since that's happened. So I'm just really not a sociable person. I don't really. I mean, it's good to have friends. It's like I value my friends more than I value blood relatives in most cases, just because I've chosen them rather than just being accidentally born into a certain family. But I guess I've given enough suggestions that COVAX can take them or leave them. And if he really wants maybe better advice, he should go to somebody who's really a more sociable, gregarious kind of person than I am. And so, I'm just going to move on to COVAX and Sipad Zidina's third question, which is a follow-up of a previous question. He says, your starting of the sutta reading made sense last time, but can you please continue with finishing it? Because I'm still unsure how to connect all the way through. And he's referring to an obscure sutta. I'm not even sure which Nikaya it's in. It's the Anguttara Nikaya or the Samyutta Nikaya. And he's using a translation from Ajahn Thanisaro, which is kind of, it's got its good points and its bad points. Ajahn Thanisaro is sort of idiosyncratic and self-indulgent in his translation style. Especially earlier on, he's kind of calmed down a little bit, I think, in later years. But still, even though Ajahn Thanisaro probably has much better actual Dhamma practice and attainment than someone like Bhikkhu Bodhi really is pretty solid as a translator. And he's sort of mainstream or like orthodox in his translations. He uses like the standard word so that you know what the Pali word is from reading the English translation, which with Ajahn Thanisaro is not necessarily the case. And still, there's like this logo Ria going back and forth on Discord with all these pop-up windows that are distracting me. So anyways, getting back to this sutta, let's see. Thus, monks, the Tathagata, when seeing what is to be seen, doesn't construe an object as seen. He doesn't construe an unseen. He doesn't construe an object to be seen. He doesn't construe a seer. When hearing, likewise. When sensing, likewise. When cognizing what is to be cognized, he doesn't construe an object as cognized. He doesn't construe an uncognized. He doesn't construe an object to be cognized. He doesn't construe a cognizer. Thus, monks, the Tathagata, being the same with regard to all phenomena that can be seen, heard, sensed, and cognized, is such. And I tell you, there is no other such, higher or more sublime. Whatever is seen or heard or sensed and fastened onto as true by others, one who is such, among the self-fettered, wouldn't further claim to be true or even false, having seen well in advance that arrow where generations are fastened and hung. I know, I see, that's just how it is. There's nothing of the Tathagata fastened. Well, this is, it's really of an archaic nature, this whole sutta, and it reminds me a lot of certain statements in the Atthakavagga, and also it reminds me of the Buddha's teaching to Bahya in the Bahya Sutta of the Udana, which is very Zen-like. In the seen there will be only the seen, in the heard there will be only the heard, etc. So, it's like cognizing, perception is just nature taking its course, and the Buddha is not really getting involved in that. He's just letting nature take its course, and it's not even a he. Really, there's no way to describe it again. It's like trying to describe two different levels of reality at the same time, and I haven't figured out how to do it. And even if I did, most of the people that listen to me wouldn't understand it. I explain the same things over and over and over, and sometimes the same people will be asking the same kind of questions. Because it's, especially if you insist on having everything make sense and interconnected, on a two-dimensional plane, then you cannot discuss two different levels of reality with everything being coherent and articulating with everything else. You can't have two different levels of reality that are at the same level. And so it's going to take some talent, I guess, at trying to work with two different levels of reality simultaneously. There's ultimate truth and there's conventional truth. There's nirvana and there's samsara. And Mahayana Buddhists say, ultimately there's no difference, but still, relatively there is a difference. And just talking about it, it's like I'm just wasting calories just talking and talking and talking about this stuff. So anyways, let's see. Thus, monks, the Tathagata, being the same with regard to all phenomena that can be seen, heard, sensed, and cognized, is such. And that's datta. Datta can be translated as such or thus or like that. And it's a word that's used in early Buddhism because you can't really describe the ultimate. And so the best you can say is just thus or such. It's like a kind of makeshift term for experiencing reality, or someone who is at the level of reality and is no longer identified with all this phantasmagoria going on at the samsaric level. He's just like that. Or like this. You can't really describe it any better. Such. So whatever is heard or seen or sensed and fastened onto as true by others, one who is such, among the self-fettered, wouldn't further claim to be true or even false. Yeah, that's like the Atthakavagga, the teachings of the Atthakavagga. You do not insist upon anything, really. Just let nature take its course. Do not get involved. It's not you. So, I really don't know how to explain it much better than the sutta itself explains it. And so if that's not good enough, you're just not going to get it, I guess. Or use it as a Zen koan and just keep stewing over it and stewing over it and stewing over it until just something snaps in your head. It's like that your cognition muscle suddenly cramps up, and suddenly you've got this clarity and silence that will actually allow you to understand it way better than any kind of thinking will help you to understand it. So, I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Pranav, or Mr. Pranav. Sometimes he goes by Mr. Pranav. So Pranav says, what happens to the people who's on the list? Well, I haven't decided yet, but it's going to be something probably that's going to happen. So I'm just going to move on to Pranav's second question. And with regard to the people on the list, it's like the people that were giving me all this advice about, like, if you've got acid reflux at night sometimes, take more acid, drink vinegar, that kind of stuff. Their name is on a list. And also people who ask more than 3 questions per episode, their name winds up on a list also. It's a different list, but it's just as serious. And I haven't decided what's going to happen, but something probably. And they're not going to like it. So Pranav's second question is, what is Patana? And Patana is the 7th book of Abhidhamma. It's the last book of the Pali Tipitaka, just going in order of, first is you've got the Vinaya at the beginning, and the first book of Vinaya is sort of controversial. Different people will say that the Patimokkha comes first, and other people will say the Mahavagga comes first. So either Parajika or the Mahavagga would be the first book of Vinaya. And then everything is in order. You get into the suttas, it's Digha Nikaya first, then Majjhima, then Samyutta, then Anguttara, and then Khuddaka. And then you got Abhidhamma. And then the Abhidhamma has a traditional order, with Patana being the last and 7th on the list. And Patana its purpose is to understand causal relations. And there are 24 of them, but really there's less than 24, because whoever came up with Patana, I don't think it was the Buddha, whoever came up with Patana has duplicate, causal relations. And let's see, I'm really rusty on my Patana, but there's Ati Paccaya and Avigata Paccaya have exactly the same meaning. They're 2 different causal relations, but they're exactly the same meaning. So why they would double up on some, the official answer, it's the harder ones, the more subtle and difficult to understand ones that are mentioned more than once, just to help people understand it better. But that's not really the case. Like Ati Paccaya and Avigata Paccaya, which are synonymous. Ati just means the existence of something, and Avigata means not having disappeared, which also means the existence of something. And that's way easier to understand than some of the other Paccayos in Patana. And I spoke with a young Abhidhamma scholar who was really into this. He was really studying it, and he said that Patana is unreadable. That a lot of senior Abhidhamma scholars, like Scholar Seatos in Burma, I mean, you can't just sit down and read a book of Patana and it's just unreadable. It's just going into all these causal relations and the various combinations of these causal relations. And it's just kind of gobbledygook, in my opinion. But unfortunately for me, in Burma, there is a phenomenon, a tradition called the Patanpwe, in which monks will chant Patana over loudspeakers, sometimes 24/7 for an entire week, just blasting, they're chanting this stuff that even they don't understand. Nobody understands it, but they're blasting it over loudspeakers for days on end sometimes, until I'd be in my cave or wherever I was as a monk in Burma, just fantasizing about taking a baseball bat into the village, not hurting anybody, but just smashing the shit out of the loudspeaker system. So, the reason why the Burmese do that is it is a tradition that when Dhamma disappears, that the last thing to disappear will be the rules of monastic discipline. Vinaya starts first on the list in the Tipitaka, and it's going to disappear last. And so the last is going to disappear first, Patana is going to be the first thing that disappears when Dhamma is disappearing from this world. And for me, I could live with that easily because I don't have any use for Patana anyway. But in order to make sure that the disappearance of Dhamma doesn't start, you've got monks in Burma just chanting it ad nauseum, just to keep it going. When personally, I think like a Burmese translation of the Dhammapada would be much more beneficial to everybody. If you want to blast some Buddhist material over loudspeaker systems, so that, I mean, the people living within a block radius, I mean, the teacups are rattling on the shelves, it's so loud. And sometimes they'll start at like 3 a.m, and with the patanpues, it's 24/7. So I'm kind of digressing, just kind of venting a little bit with frustration over patanpues that I'll probably never hear again. And when I came to a Burmese monastery in America, they were having a patanpue where there was just this one monk who was like staying up late at night just chanting patan over like a loudspeaker in the meditation hall. Just, I mean, he couldn't blast it because, of course, in America, the neighbors are going to be calling the cops pretty quickly. But still, it was enough to be so noisy that I couldn't sleep at night. And it's just, I mean, there's no real benefit to it, as far as I know, other than just the discipline of monks just chanting this blah, blah, blah that even they don't really understand. Adipadi pisayena pisayo. Just over and over and over, just this. It's not good. But that's what Patana is. It's this thick book. It's several volumes. It's called one book, but it's several volumes of all these different combinations of these 24 causal relations that really nobody needs to know. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. Romeo says, I realize that you are a Buddhist, but my questions this week ask that you tap into your knowledge of Hinduism. I ask these questions in light of newly appointed FBI Director Kash Patel recently being sworn in with his hand on a Bhagavad Gita rather than a Bible. That's interesting. With Hindus like Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, and Vivek Ramaswamy increasingly gaining influence in the U.S. government, I would like to become more familiar with the religion that is guiding such figures spiritually. Can you please break down Hinduism in as succinct a way as possible? And that's difficult. It's much more difficult to describe Hinduism succinctly than to describe, say, Christianity succinctly. Because Hinduism is a very vague and nebulous term that technically I would say the definition of Hinduism would be any kind of religious system that considers the Vedas to be authoritative doctrine. And so Hinduism goes back to the Vedas. Originally, like in the Buddhist time, there were 3 Vedas. Probably originally there was one, the Rig Veda, what is now called the Rig Veda. Then you had the Sama Veda and the Yajur Veda, which it's my understanding that the Sama Veda and the Yajur Veda are just like copying hymns from the Rig Veda. I don't know if there's any like original material in the Yajur Veda or the Sama Veda, but they were mainly used by priests to be reciting these, to be chanting these when doing fire sacrifices. And this was like very ancient, like Indo-European religion as it manifested in northwestern India. Like when the Indo-Aryans invaded, they were already had like at least the earliest hymns from the Rig Veda composed, and they were recited by priests when sacrificing at the holy fire for the sake of mainly worldly stuff like sons and cattle and victory in battle and that kind of thing. But when Hinduism arrived in India, there was already an existent spiritual tradition, like which manifested in the Buddhist time as the Shramana tradition. It was all these like shaven-headed philosophers who did not consider the Vedas to be authoritative. They tended to be more atheistic, and they considered samsara to be a kind of bad place to be escaped from or transcended. And there's a lot of that in Buddhism also. There was like an emphasis on karma, how you have to purify yourself in order to free yourself from this dirty world, kind of a philosophy. And so early like Brahmanism kind of came into contact with this and was influenced by it. And then so Brahmanism became more and more shamanistic and more yogic, like especially with regard to the Upanishads. I guess the Vedas, the Vedic tradition has three levels. First, you've got the Vedas themselves, and then you've got what are called the Brahmanas, which were like technical manuals on sacrifice, which almost nobody reads anymore, other than maybe a few Brahmin priests. But they're considered to be part of the Vedic literature. And then after that came the Upanishads. And then the Upanishads are getting, very Buddhist-like. In possibly some of the later Upanishads were significantly influenced by Buddhist philosophy. And then as this kind of sort of yogic Vedism traveled farther into southern India, they started interacting with more of a kind of devotionalistic paganism, worshiping the gods. And I mean, in a sense that was not the same as the way the early like Indo-Aryans were worshiping the gods, where they're just like making sacrifices to the gods in order to get stuff. It became more of just this devotional, like you just dedicate yourself to this god, and that has manifested in like modern Indian Hinduism, mainly with regard to the Vaishnavites and the Shaivites. And then you got like devotees of Kali and devotees of certain other gods. But it seems like the two main ones are Vishnu and Shiva. And so it's got all these different elements. And I mean, you can do just about anything. I mean, there's been like people, like mass murderers that were supposedly like devotees of Kali or something that were still like practicing Hindus. So Hinduism is just like this broad spectrum of all sorts of different elements. And it has incorporated a lot of Shramana stuff, especially through yoga. Yoga was originally, like I was mentioning in a previous Q&A not too long ago, it was one of these Shramana traditions called Sankhya, similar to Buddhism or Jainism. And it just got absorbed, part of it got absorbed into the Vedic tradition by these Sankhya philosophers saying, okay, we accept the Vedas as authoritative. And almost nobody even reads the Vedas anymore. Like the Bhagavad Gita is the book Kash Patel had his hand on, not the Rig Veda, because the Rig Veda is so archaic that it really doesn't speak to modern Indians anymore. It's all hymns to gods that have pretty much, I mean, they're not nearly as important anymore. Like the main god of the Rig Veda would be Indra, who was like the patron deity of the Indo-Aryans. And I think Agni, the god of fire, who's like the messenger of the gods, he's like sending the sacrifices up to the gods through the fire. That I think he's number two. And I mean, Indra and Agni, they're really not all that important in modern Hinduism anymore. I mean, I'm sure that there are some Hindus that consider them still to be very important, but I mean, Vishnu and Shiva have pretty much taken over, and including like different incarnations of Vishnu, which would be like, especially Krishna and Rama. And the two main epic poems of India, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, they're about two different avatars of Vishnu. At least they have come to be interpreted that way. So Hinduism, I mean, it's got some of the same kind of elements as Buddhism. Like morality is pretty similar. The concept of karma is fairly similar, although it's got way more devotionalism, like dedication to gods and so forth. And I think like bhakti yoga is way more of a thing in Hinduism than it is in Buddhism. Also like karma yoga, which is just good deeds, feeding the hungry and helping the poor and, serving others is more of a thing in Hinduism than in Buddhism, or at least for some Hindus. Some Hindus don't have any use for serving others. It just depends on just what part of the spectrum of Hinduism you're going to prefer, which is going to be largely, dependent on, what family you were brought up in and what kind of neighborhood and what the local temple is, who your guru is, your family guru, that kind of thing. So Hinduism is just, in a way, it's kind of like Mahayana Buddhism, where it's just this broad spectrum of everything from the ridiculous to the sublime. But it's really hard to describe it very succinctly. And so I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is also from Romeo. And Romeo says, if the 10 Commandments of the Bible generally guides Christian ethics, what guides Hindu ethics? And I mean, you do have old, very Vedic kind of texts, like the laws of Manu, which are, it's sort of like the Jewish Torah. It pretty much describes, it's got all kinds of things, like a Brahmin should never point at a pregnant cow. This really weird, obscure kind of rules. And I don't think that they're really considered to be authoritative. I'm sure that the average Hindu is just flouting the laws of Manu pretty much on a daily basis. So I think Hindu ethics is largely just tradition. It's like I already mentioned, they have a similar idea of ethics as Buddhism. They have a little more devotionalism mixed in, like the Bhagavad Gita. It acknowledges that there's karma and all that, but still, in Hinduism, you've got your ashrama dharma, which is like your sacred duty. So if you're a soldier, it's your sacred duty to kill enemies, even though it makes bad karma. But you just, according to the Bhagavad Gita, you just offer up the fruits of all of your actions to God. You just lay the fruits of your actions before God. He kind of absorbs that, and then you remain in a way pure. So there's more of that kind of thing in Hindu ethics than in Buddhist ethics. There's no Buddhist text, certainly no Theravada Buddhist text, saying that you just offer up the fruits of your actions to the Buddha, and then if you're a soldier, you kill your enemies. It just doesn't work that way. So, yeah, I mean, even technically somebody like Krishnamurti could be considered more or less of a Hindu in this weird way. I mean, some Hindus will say Buddhism is a form of Hinduism. Even Christianity is a form of Hinduism. I think a lot of Hindu people, some people will call it Sanatana Dharma because Hindu is so notoriously meaningless. It's just so diffuse and nebulous of a term that, it has almost no meaning at all. It just means it's sort of like an Indian religion that maybe accepts the Vedas as authoritative. So, yeah, some Hindus would go so far as to say, even if you don't accept the Vedas, that still you can be a Hindu. The Hare Krishnas are Hindus. And they don't really have much use of anything other than just reciting the names of Vishnu. That is their stairway to heaven, essentially. That is their route to salvation, is just repeating the names of God over and over again. So, yeah, it's so diffuse of a term, Hinduism, that it's hard to even call it a single religion. Like, you can say the religion of Bali also is Hinduism, but you look at the religion of Bali and there's obvious overlap with the religion of India, of various parts of India, like South India, but still they're just all these different unique or just distinct practices and beliefs that just all fit under the term Hindu. So what guides Hindu ethics is mainly just tradition. I don't think that there's a single list of rules or a single text. I think it's just tradition over thousands of years has just settled on what is good ethics, and certain rules like stealing, not stealing, are just kind of stereotypically notoriously ignored in India. They might not kill a cockroach, but So, I mean, some Hindus, they won't kill a cockroach, but they'll steal anything that isn't nailed down. My father used to work on ships, and he said that the Hindu ships were the worst. That he saw a friend of his set his coat down, and all of a sudden the coat just starts lifting up because there's this Hindu sailor with a fishing pole. He's hooked it from an upper floor, like an upper level of the ship. He's just reeling it up. He's just ripping off the guy's coat right behind him. It was not good. Not that I'm saying that all Indian people or all Hindus are thieves any more than I would say that they all wiped their butt with their hand. But it's kind of a stereotype that is based on a certain trend. But they do take ahimsa like relatively seriously. At least a lot of them do. But I don't know if there's any particular list of rules anywhere in Hinduism that Hindus refer to as a guide with regard to what they should do and what they shouldn't do. In Buddhism, lay people have 5 precepts, sometimes 8 precepts. Monks have got all the Vinaya rules. But with regard to like Hindu monks or Hindu lay people, I'm not 100% sure what they rely on other than just 1,000-year-old tradition. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's third question, which is, what does Hinduism say about non-Hindus? And again, it depends on the Hindu. Like I was saying earlier, like some Hindus would just incorporate any kind of genuine spirituality into Hinduism. They'd say it's all Dharma. So Jesus was a Hindu and the Buddha was a Hindu, whereas other Hindus are less tolerant and would say, anyone who isn't a Hindu who accepts the Vedas as authoritative, even though almost no Hindus read the Vedas, that, they're just have wrong view and they're going to get a bad rebirth because of that. With regard to somebody like Kash Patel or Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, they're not outwardly very Hindu. They don't have like the red spot or anything like that. You never see Kash Patel with like the ashes smeared on his forehead after giving some like offering to Vishnu, anything like that. So for them, it might just be kind of a superficial thing, or either that or just kind of a very private thing where if they're feeling spiritual, that, when they're alone in their free time, which isn't very often, they'll just kind of interpret it along Hindu lines, something like that. But none of them strikes me as like overtly Hindu in their speech or behavior. So now that I've kind of like wallowed, kind of blundered my way through 3 Hinduism questions, and I didn't mean to insult any Indian people by mentioning that thievery is very common. I had my sandals stolen in India. They're size 13 sandals. They were like flip-flops. They were all chewed up by rats from when I was in Thailand previously. This disappeared. So I went without sandals. I went barefoot most of my stay in India just because they got ripped off relatively early on. But it could just be one Indian guy that's doing all of it. He just gets around a lot. So I'm not accusing all Indians of being that way. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. I'm just checking the time. This is from Rui, as I was saying. And Rui says, to live a blameless or virtuous life without expecting a reward, and to live a blameless, virtuous life suspecting that there is no reward at all, are slightly different things, are they not? Is the latter even possible? Well, that's 2 question marks. That's 2 questions. We've got to separate these. Okay. Oh, what the hell happened? Let's see. Now I got to separate it again. And now I got to eliminate this space. Okay, we're ready. So, to live a blameless, virtuous life without expecting a reward, and to live a blameless, virtuous life suspecting that there is no reward at all, are slightly different things. Yeah, that would be different, obviously. I mean, if they weren't different, you could just say the same thing twice instead of saying 2 different things. So, I mean, there is some overlap, though. I mean, obviously, to live a blameless, virtuous life without expecting a reward would be a subset. No, it would be the people that don't think there is a reward would be a subset of the people who don't expect a reward. Because there's some people that would expect that there is one, but still they're not concerned with that. Like people who take the Bhagavad Gita seriously, who try to live according to the Bhagavad Gita, they might live life just sort of not caring what kind of reward there is going to be. They just offer it up to God, whatever it is. So to live a blameless, virtuous life, suspecting there is no reward at all, I mean, that would be a little more tricky. Because, I mean, there's different people like that. I mean, some people, you could say they suspect that there is no reward at all, but maybe they're just mistaken. And that deep down at the level below suspicion, they still know, what Dhamma is about. At least they have a deep feeling for it. And so they're just kind of drawn to being virtuous, even though at this superficial level, they're like nihilistic atheist materialists. But deeper down, at the subconscious level, they know better. So there could be people like that who at the surface think, all this stuff about karma is bullshit and there's no rewards or punishments, but still they're going to be kind to others and be honest and this kind of thing. That can happen. And then there's like another similar case where you think that there's no reward, but still it makes you feel icky to tell lies or to steal. I mean, obviously there's still a reward, even though they suspect that there is no reward, and they're influenced by the fact that there clearly is a reward because, they just don't feel right if they're lying or getting into trouble. It's like, obviously, just living a blameless, virtuous life, at least it keeps you out of trouble. I mean, that's even a materialist can accept that much. So it's kind of tricky suspecting that there is no reward. I mean, you'd have to be some kind of weird radical philosopher to even deny that like stealing can land you in jail, or that like insulting people to their face can get you punched in the nose. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure where Rui would draw the line with regard to reward and no reward, because there's obviously rewards to living a virtuous life, or at least lack of punishment. That even a dog knows that much. The dog knows not to shit on the floor because it's going to get punished if it does it. So Rui says, is the latter even possible? So that's kind of what I was getting at, I suppose. People that suspect that there is no reward. I'm sure that there are some people like at this superficial level, the intellectual level, that they suspect that there is no reward, or just say, just setting aside police and reputation and that kind of thing. And you're just thinking along the lines of like metaphysical stuff, paranormal stuff, karma, that kind of thing. Then yeah, there's people that can live a spiritual life, at the superficial level being, nihilistic atheists and materialists, but deeper down, they know better. Subconsciously, they know better, and they just feel wrong if they tell a lie. They just feel like soiled or something if they do something shitty. So, yeah, I mean, most people are not fully aware of most of their mind. That the subconscious mind is greater than the conscious mind. The conscious mind is just that part of our mind that is sort of self-referential. And so it kind of is able to look at itself, but there's other parts that it just can't look in that direction. It doesn't know how to look in that direction. And I've heard that sort of what wisdom is just sort of like the wiser you are, the less subconscious mind you have, the more conscious, the more you become aware of what would ordinarily be subconscious, something along all those lines. So technically you could say a fully enlightened being wouldn't have a subconscious mind. So I think I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, et cetera, because his name just keeps getting longer and longer. And so we just gotta have to we have to draw the line somewhere. We just can't let his name keep getting longer and longer. So it's just Stellar Supreme, et cetera. And Stellar Supreme, etc. says, I suspect that I might have hyperthyroidism. If it is the case, they typically prescribe non-intoxicating drugs called beta blockers, which can actually be healthy for the heart like a supplement and are relatively cheap to buy. He's got $4 to $15 for a 30-day supply. Do you suspect that this could interfere with my pursuit of the monk life? Added context, I plan to donate about $5,000 to $10,000 when I ordain. Well, I mean, the added context should be irrelevant, because if you're going to be donating money right before you become a monk, I mean, there shouldn't be any strings attached. It should just be a real donation and not sort of like an investment. You know, I'll donate this money so long as you buy me medicine from the money I donated. I mean, you can do it that way, and I think there'd probably be people going along with it, but still, I mean, it wouldn't be like a pure donation if you're donating the money expecting something in return. So with regard to like becoming a monk when you have a health condition that requires relatively cheap medicine, I mean, it could be a problem if you decide to go and live in a cave in some remote area of Asia. Then it might be a problem. You might have to, like, it'd probably be fairly easy to have a donor who can supply that stuff to you, but you might have to carry around, you know, more than a month's supply of it. If you're going out anywhere remote, you know, you just got to make sure you got enough to last the time that you're out there. I'm not sure how easy it would be to get this kind of stuff in Thailand. I assume you can get it in Bangkok, and then you can have some donor supporter in Bangkok who like sends it to you or something like that. So it shouldn't be like I mean, it shouldn't prevent you from becoming a monk. It is unfortunate, and it can be, and this happens a lot, that just through Dhamma practice, the situation clears up. And that happens a lot. I mean, people have been cured of tuberculosis and like tumors and stuff through intensive Dhamma practice. In my case, it's to some degree, it actually went the other way. I used to have like really blotchy skin, like seborrheic dermatitis would be the technical term for it. And some of my early Q&As, like right after I dropped out of the monkhood, there was like that one that I did from a hotel room in New Orleans where I had just spent like 2 days without bathing, sitting on a train. And I had just shaved, and it was just like this red rash on my face. And I used to think, where am I going to get the medication? Because there was this good skin cream from Korea that worked that I could get in Burma, but I didn't know of any way of getting it in America. It's like, what am I going to do? And then it just went away. I haven't had that problem. It's like the love of my woman or something along those lines has just caused that condition to just stop being an issue. So, I mean, it is possible though that just through Dhamma practice, I mean, if you protect Dhamma, Dhamma protects you, and you're just going to get what you need. So, yeah, I don't think that it should be any problem, although I wouldn't, I mean, you're going to find if you are ordained, it doesn't matter if you're ordained in America or in Asia, there's going to be very generous Asian patrons who are very happy to support you. Like in Burma, you got like the Pisile Ba Dayaka, who is a supporter, and they can even like adopt you and like sponsor your ordination and everything. Make sure you've got all the robes and everything you need. They're really happy about that. It's to some degree, it's a kind of spiritual materialism where they're getting merit by supporting the Sangha. They're really happy to spread Dhamma to the West and to Westerners. You know, you're like the exotic special flavor of monk because you're a Westerner. And so you're not going to have any problem getting support, especially if you're a serious monk. If you're a sincere, serious monk, they're going to respect that, especially because most Asian monks really aren't all that serious. I mean, some really are, but most of them aren't. So, I mean, it's unnecessary to have money donated to the monastery with the expectation of that money being used, at least in part, to provide you with medicine or whatever, when you should just let go and let Dhamma protect you. And if you're a good monk, you're going to get more than enough support. That would be my advice. And so I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, etc.'s follow-up question. He says, but if I plan to settle in Thailand, starting out in the US, should I reserve that donation for the monastery there instead? I asked because of the dilemma of setting out provisions for the future. Well, if you're a monk, you shouldn't be worrying about the future. Give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat or where you will sleep. Seriously. I mean, don't be making these kind of plans where you're going to have like this stipend, this allowance or whatever it is you're still thinking in terms of money and like survival mode. And I mean, if you just, this works in Hinduism and Buddhism, where you just like put yourself out at the mercy of the universe and you live a virtuous life, the universe will protect you. You'll get exactly what you need. So if you're going to decide between like donating $5,000 to $10,000 to a monastery in America or to a monastery in Thailand, it shouldn't have anything to do with supporting you or you getting any monetary benefit out of that. It's just which one needs the money more, something along those lines. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jules. And Jules is asking for a friend. Does visiting prostitutes violate the precept against sexual misconduct for a layperson? And yes, of course it does. I mean, that should be a no-brainer. Just think about it for a second or two. I mean, Buddhism is different from other religions in certain fundamental, important ways. But Buddhism is more against wallowing in sensuality than most religions. I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, even listening to music is immoral. So, I mean, visiting prostitutes, yeah. I mean, the precept against sexual misconduct or sensual misconduct, kamesu michachara, it's mainly rules out everything except for a loving monogamous relationship, or at least a dutiful monogamous relationship. That any kind of sexual promiscuity is a no-no. And also messing around with women that are like already spoken for, like another man's wife, another man's fiance, another man's slave girl, anything like that, that's out. So of course adultery is out, but it's not as, Buddhism is not as strict as, say, Christianity, in that marriage is just purely a secular institution. It's not involved in early Buddhism, that it's forbidden for a monk to even participate in a wedding ceremony. That's just not Buddhism. That's just something completely else. And so whether you're actually married or not is largely irrelevant, so long as you are like in a loving or at least dutiful monogamous relationship and not like violating any obligations to anybody else, and the person you're sleeping with isn't violating obligations to anybody else. But going out and picking up prostitutes or just picking up drunken women in bars, no, it doesn't work that way. One night stands are definitely sensual misconduct from the Buddhist point of view. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, what's your opinion of Kasina meditation? And Kasina meditation was a much bigger deal in ancient and early medieval times than it is today. The founder of the tradition, which I was ordained, Tom Pulusiano, knew how to do Kasina meditation. He could teach Kasina meditation, but I never really practiced it. I mean, the closest I came to Kasina meditation might be like just contemplating a candle flame. In a way, that's sort of like fire Kasina. Or sometimes when I'd be out in the forest, you just kind of pitch You pick like a relatively circular patch of green in the greenery that's, a slightly different shade of green. It's like in the shade or something, that I just like rest my gaze on that and just kind of go empty. But it wasn't really Kasina meditation. Kasina meditation is mainly you're meditating on a colored disc or some kind of disc. I mean, there's also like earth Kasina, where you take mud and you just sort of paint a circle onto some board or something, and then that's like a circle of earth that you can meditate on. Light Kasina, I've read that some monks will just cut a circular hole in the side of their hut so that the light shining through is their light Kasina. It's like a circular, circle of light, essentially. Some of them I'm not sure how you'd make a circle out of. Like fire Kasina, it'd be kind of tricky making a circular flame, but I assume you could work it out somehow. But if you read the Visuddhimagga, they're mainly dealing with Kasina meditation. The Visuddhimagga can be considered a kind of meditation manual, and the main kind of meditation is Kasina, and it's like you're contemplating a disc. It's like the hypnotic object, and it really is kind of like hypnosis. It's maybe a bit more like advanced and complex and subtle than ordinary hypnosis, but still, it's like you focus on this Kasina disc. That is the meditative object, and you just keep staring at that, contemplating it, until when you close your eyes, you can see it just as clearly as when your eyes are open. It's like you've just got it like burned into your mind, this circle, and then you start manipulating it, making it bigger and smaller and this kind of thing, until it's like, in a way, it's sort of like a mental exercise, just strengthening your samadhi, strengthening your concentration. And then you can get into jhanic states as a result of this. But it's kind of fallen by the wayside. The main kind of meditation in Theravada Buddhism is pretty much meditation on the breath, anapana. In Thailand, they do a lot of mantra, Buddho, or Puto. Metta meditation is big in some places among some people. And Kasina has just pretty much died out. But if you want to understand Kasina meditation, the Visuddhimagga has fairly elaborate explanations of it. I do think that it's largely a hypnotic method, like the Stanford Hypnosis Lab. In Stanford University, they've got a hypnosis lab. And so because they're trying to study hypnosis scientifically, they have to have standardized methods. They have to hypnotize everyone as much the same as possible to get rid of any kind of like random variations, so they can just focus on what they're trying to understand. And at the Stanford Hypnosis Lab, at least at the time that I read the book that was written from a guy that worked at the Stanford Hypnosis Lab, they start off staring at a circle. It's generally a very small one. It could just be like the head of a thumbtack stuck into the wall directly in front of the person. So it's smaller than the average Kasina disc, but still it is just focusing on a disc, focusing on a circle on the wall. And so there is kind of, if you don't have a good guide, a good teacher, when you're hypnotizing yourself, you can experience what you think you ought to experience, and you can lead yourself astray if you do not have a skillful teacher who is guiding you through it. So, yeah, maybe read up on it in the Visuddhimagga, or if you can find a teacher who actually teaches Kasina meditation, which is going to be relatively rare in the West, then maybe you could consult with them. But personally, I think you'd probably be better off with the breath or some other kind of mindfulness meditation than Kasina meditation. But it depends on what your purposes are. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Dhamma River, which is as follows. Do you think there is any university left in the US or Canada that is not an indoctrination camp? Well, with regard to indoctrination camps, it may be that pretty much every university in the US to some degree is going to be an indoctrination camp. You're always going to have a certain, I don't know of any university in the West where like cultural Marxism, progressivism is just completely banned. There's always going to be an element of that, I think. But some I almost said some monasteries, some universities, I mean, they're going to be safer than others in that regard. Like the University of Chicago has a reputation for promoting free speech. So you're definitely going to have the hysterical progressives there, but at the very least, you're also going to have like alternate points of view there. And also I read that like more and more wealthy people from like New England are sending their kids to universities in the South, like in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, because even though in the South also, I mean, university towns, there's going to be lots of hysterical progressives, but you're still going to have like the conservative Christian groups there that are allowed, they're not going to be persecuted. So, I mean, it may be your best bet with regard to the average university is to find one where even though there's still going to be plenty of hysterical progressivism, there's going to also be at least a tolerance of other points of view. And of course, you've got some like specifically right-wing kind of university, like Hillsdale College. I don't know if that's just online. I don't know if they have an actual campus or not, but I mean, there's places like that also. I think it's called Hillsdale College. It's the one that Victor Davis Hanson is associated with. So, do I think there's any university left in the U.S. or Canada that is not an indoctrination camp? It depends on what you mean by an indoctrination camp, because even Hillsdale College is going to be indoctrinating you in a more conservative direction. Any kind of university is going to be like teaching you something as this is the way it is, even if you're encouraged, at times to like have critical thought and question everything. Still, it's not like you're going to go to any university where the professor is standing up there and just saying, well, this is just a suggestion, but it may be, and that all of his classes are taught that way. That, it's all just, you can take this or leave it, it's just an idea. That's not really much teaching, seems to me. So, some universities are definitely going to have less like leftist indoctrination. And even some of the ones that have good reputations, like University of Chicago, it's certainly going to have a certain amount of leftist indoctrination, but it's also going to have like alternative points of view. And hopefully, you'll be able to take certain classes and not just get punished by a leftist professor if he finds out that you're not a leftist too. That would be like your main problem, I think, at a university level, is you're taking like liberal arts, you're trying to get a degree in English or something, and that you might be in like the hysterical progressive bubble. And if the professor finds out that you're like a fascist, then he can fail you just finding fault with anything that you say. So that's STEM, engineering, physics, mathematics, that kind of thing is going to be less susceptible to leftist hysteria than like history or English, liberal arts in general. But yeah, it's not a totally hopeless case. It is possible to still get a university education without just having your mind turned to shit by hysterical leftists. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Captain Bogumik Klumka. And Trzaskaz is, I think he misheard my name of this captain of this Polish ship I worked on. His name was Bogumik Klumka, but Trzaskaz has Bogumik ending in the L with the line through it, which I think is like an SH sound. So it'd be Bogumish Klumka. No, his name was Bogumik. It ended in a K, I'm pretty sure. And klamka, it's my understanding that klamka in Polish means door handle. So it's I don't know. Things are just getting very confused. I think Trzaska's is becoming more and more confused with regard to who he really is. Anyways, Captain Bogumik Klamka says, when you say that karma lands you exactly where you need to be, does it mean that in the concept karma, does it mean that in that concept, karma knows the future in some sense? No, it doesn't. Karma does not know the future. Karma just lands you where you need to be now. So it knows the present, I guess, in a sense. But it's more like just water seeking its own level. Water doesn't know the future to know that it has to flow this way downhill instead of that way uphill. It's just nature taking its course. And that's the way your karma is your karma is like water flowing downhill in a way. It's just sort of taking the path of least resistance. And I mean, you just have to be in a certain position. I mean, the karma just leads you where it needs to go. So yeah, it doesn't really know the future any more than water knows the future when it flows downhill instead of uphill. It's just karma is just flowing in the direction that it needs to flow without really thinking about the future or even the past for that matter, because it's just momentum. It's just the momentum of your mind. And it's not that it's landing you in this particular like materialistic environment. It's creating it really. I mean, materialistic environments are mind-made. So I do think that a lot of people that watch my videos and a lot of like Western Buddhists in general just accept materialism as just established fact. That's like their worldview. And then they try to fit Buddhism into that. And I don't think it's that way at all. I think physical matter, I do not think it really exists. Of course, that just makes me a weirdo from a modern or postmodern American point of view. So, let's see. I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Captain Bogumik Klamka. And he says, is Theravadan concept of time linear or recurrent? I mean, when there is a big bang and then big collapse and another big bang, then maybe we are living the exact same lives in the next universe and the next and so on. Well, if that were the case, there'd be no enlightenment at all. I mean, if that were the case, there would be no enlightenment because you'd just be trapped into just living the same unenlightened life over and over again. Because if you did become enlightened, you already did it the first cycle through an infinitely long period of time ago. So, I mean, in Buddhism, they do have a cyclical conception of time, but it's not like an exact repetition. I think Nietzsche taught something like this, eternal recurrence. But it's more like the seasons. You know, you've got winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. It happens in a kind of cycle, even though every winter is not exactly the same as the winter before it. Every summer is not exactly the same as the summer before it. It's a kind of cycle. And Buddhism also talks about world cycles, expansion and contraction of the cosmos. And in Buddhism, you've got every time the world evolves, there's going to be an India, and Buddhas always they go through the same kind of life, biography. They're always a Buddha always belongs to whichever caste happens to be considered the highest at the time. So the idea is the Buddha was a Kshatriya because in the Buddha's time, the Kshatriyas were considered to be the highest caste. And then later, other times, the Brahmins are considered to be the highest caste, and the Buddha is going to be a Brahmin. And then he's got to renounce the world, taking some kind of vehicle to renounce the world. And then he's going to do these harsh austerities, the Dukkaracharya, and he's going to have certain people doing the austerities with him. And then he's going to get enlightened sitting under a certain tree after receiving milk rice from a woman. And, it's the same kind of template, but it's not the same Buddha every time, and there's always differences. So there's certain patterns that are cyclically repeated in time, but it's not just an exact like rerun, because if it was an exact rerun, there could be really no Dhamma, because nobody could possibly become enlightened unless you just, like a questioner asked earlier on, it's like you become enlightened and then reset hits and then you're unenlightened again, and then you have to become enlightened just over and over and over again. But Buddhism doesn't teach that, and I don't think that's the way it works. So I guess I answered that one more or less. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're getting close to the bottom here. No worries there. We're going to be way less than 3 hours. Not less than 2 hours, though. So this next question is from PSA. And PSA says, do you like doing the gritty? And I don't even know what the gritty is. My woman is of the opinion that it's some kind of dance, but no, I don't dance that much, if at all. And even if the gritty isn't a dance, I'm pretty sure I don't do the gritty unless gritty is like cooking something on a griddle. And I don't think we even have a griddle. Maybe we have a griddle, but I don't know. So yeah, let's just skip that question because I don't even know what the gritty is. Next question from PSA. What is your favorite sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya and why? Well, the first sutta that comes to mind would be the Dighanakha Sutta, which I mentioned, I think, in the previous Q&A. And the reason why I like the Dighanakha Sutta is because the message is an archaic message. You know, it's apparently a very old sutta that, you know, it's just saying, don't believe anything. And according to the sutta, there's a non-Buddhist philosopher named Dighanakha, who is a relative of Venerable Sariputta, who was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples. And so Venerable Sariputta is fanning the Buddha while this conversation is taking place between the Buddha and the non-Buddhist philosopher Dighanakha. And Dighanakha says, nothing is acceptable to me. And the implication is that no belief, no point of view is acceptable to him. Like, he's a radical skeptic. And then the Buddha says, well, this idea that nothing is acceptable to you is acceptable to you, isn't it? So, I mean, you still have this belief. You still have one belief too many. You still have this one last attachment. And then it caused Dighanakha to have a kind of insight. He didn't become fully enlightened, but I think he became a Sotapanna or some such. But it caused Sariputta to become enlightened. So this is a relatively early sutta, at least even going with like the traditional timeline, because this is the sutta that caused one of his chief disciples to become enlightened. Another one of my favorite suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya is the Alagadupama Sutta, which I mentioned before. It contains the simile of the raft, the simile of the water snake. It's, in a way, it's sort of like a compilation of well-known sayings of the Buddha that were considered to be important. And it's just like in different little chapters, you know, different scenes. So it's possibly a later sutta that is a compilation of older material. And I mean, the simile of the raft is really an important one to bear in mind. You know, it's an important sutta or important simile if you want to understand Dhamma, it helps for you to understand that Dhamma is a raft made of rubbish, that it's not some kind of sacred golden law, you know, that's, you know, just completely sublime and perfect and sacred. It's just this jerry-rigged contraption made of rubbish that you use to get across the flood of samsara, and then you just throw it away. So, PSA, this next one isn't exactly a question. It's just, he left this comment, and I would like to comment upon the comment. PSA says, I asked ChatGPT, what's the meaning of your name? And this is the answer. So, ChatGPT speaks. The term pannobhasa, and then in Pali, for some reason, it has the name pannobhasa in Devanagari script. So the term pannobhasa, and then Pali in Devanagari script, translates to language of wisdom or speech of wisdom. It is derived from two components, Panya, meaning wisdom or insight, bhasa, meaning speech or language. In Buddhist texts, pannobhasa refers to speech or communication that reflects wisdom, especially in the context of expressing teachings, understanding, and insight in a way that leads to enlightenment or deeper understanding of reality. The term emphasizes the power of wise speech, one that is informed by the right understanding of the nature of existence, leading others toward clarity and wisdom, and ChatGPT is wrong. In a way, this is kind of good news for people who are concerned about AI becoming omniscient and just sentient and taking over, because ChatGPT doesn't know what the fuck it's talking about. I mean, the panya part is good. That panya means wisdom or understanding, something like that. But obasa, I mean, it completely leaves out the O. That it would just be pannobhasa and not pannobhasa if it meant, speech of wisdom, which it doesn't. Obasa, bhasa, just forget the O for a second. Bhasa can have two different meanings. It can mean language, or it can mean light. And so obhasa can have two different meanings. That O is a prefix. In Sanskrit, it would be ava, A-V-A. In Pali, it's just O. And it implies a downward motion. So with regard to light, it means like downshine, sort of like the sun shining down on us. But in language, it's like speaking down, which means like insinuation. It's like innuendo. And pretty obviously, my name doesn't mean innuendo of wisdom. That it means downshine of wisdom. It's like understanding shine. So ChatGPT doesn't know its Pali very well. Let's just leave it at that. And that wasn't even a question. So let's just move on to the next question. And this is the very last question. Very last one. This is from Orkbold. And Orkbold says, does listening to dissonant and evil-sounding music produce negative karma? The reason why I ask this is because I enjoy extreme metal, black metal to be specific, which usually deals with morbid themes and uses dissonant chords to produce an especially infernal atmosphere. I don't find myself in negative states when I listen to this stuff, but I wonder if it still affects me anyways. Well, if it didn't affect you, it would have no effect on you, and then you wouldn't bother to listen to it. Obviously, it has an effect. And as I mentioned earlier, in Buddhism, listening to any music is more or less immoral because it's wallowing in sensuality. So, for lay people, you're not going to be a perfected saint in this life so long as you remain a lay person with a job and a family and, just secular interactions to participate in and all that. So, just listening to music, I listen to music sometimes too. But, listening to devil music, definitely, it's going to have an effect on you. I don't like black metal, like this throat screechy stuff. It's like deliberately ugly. It's deliberate ugliness in that sense. Some of the guitar might be really good, but, and there might be sort of transitioning back and forth between like real singing and like melodic kind of music, and then just the roaring and screeching. But listening to all that roaring and screeching, it's certainly going to have an effect on you. And if it didn't have any effect, you wouldn't bother to listen to it. And my brother used to listen to a lot of like really like heavy metal, like Iron Maiden kind of stuff. And even the album covers, it's all these demonic, what's his name? Eddie and all these, he's obviously some kind of demon. And just the metal, the music itself, it's not conducive to peace of mind. It's more conducive to agitation. I can't really just pronounce definitively that it's going to have a negative, bad effect on anyone who listens to it. But if you listen to it like analytically, just trying to understand the the chord patterns and all this kind of stuff, it might be no worse than any other kind of music. But just getting into listening to morbid lyrics and just the screeching and roaring and all that, yeah, it's definitely going to have sort of like a more or less demonic kind of influence on your mind. Not that I'm suggesting that you should be listening to ABBA or the Bay City Rollers or something like that. Man. But I have to admit, I do like hard metal, but it has to be like melodious. Like, just look at like Leo Moraccioli and some of his covers. He does like metal covers of non-metal songs, like Funky Cold Medina by Leo Moraccioli, who's got like a braided beard. It looks really nice. I might do that someday. But I mean, some of the guitar playing in that is just really good, even though he does some yelling, but it's like good spirit. I mean, Funky Cold Medina is not exactly a satanic song. It's about like an aphrodisiac, but it's like a joke song. Or Leo Moraccioli's cover of Blue Monday. That's good too. That's really good. Or just Led Zeppelin. I mean, I realize that Jimmy Page may have made a deal with the devil. You know, he may have worshiped demons or some such, but at least their music is, you know, it's musical. But then again, people have different standards. Some people like banjo music. I mean, Foggy Mountain Breakdown is good listening, I have to admit. Some people like country western music. I just do not like country western music. I've never liked it. Music is a kind of emotional communication. You know, it's like an emotional language, and it's not really so much in words, even though you've got lyrics, but it's more at an emotional level. It's like conveying emotions to the hearer. And some people just like these sappy kind of emotions, like people in, like, I don't know, like really mellow music doesn't really appeal to me. So I have to admit, I do prefer music as a kind of stimulant than a sedative. That if I want to calm down, I'll just listen to silence. So I don't like music that's supposed to like mellow you out and calm you down, because silence works better for that. But some, like a certain kind of caffeine kind of effect, that some good rock and roll, I really like that. But yeah, my own feeling is this isn't really an intellectual, philosophical idea. It's just more of this feeling that I have that, I mean, you listen to like demonic, throat screechy kind of roaring music, it is going to have more of a negative effect than if you listen to something uplifting. So I guess I answered that question, and so I guess I answered all the questions, and so I guess we're done. And so, like I always should say at the beginning and almost never do, if you have any questions you think I could answer about early Buddhism, about Buddhism in general, Theravada Buddhism in particular, like Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy, monasticism, meditation, me personally, that kind of stuff, there's a good chance I'll be able to answer it in something remotely resembling an intelligent manner. But I mean, if you like YouTube personalities, people that have written a book and are kind of famous, there's a good chance I will have never heard of these persons, just like I've never heard of Doing the Gritty. So just bear that in mind. And no more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And I guess I should say, if you haven't liked this video, but you made it this far, you apparently liked it at least a little bit, so you might as well hit the like button. Feel free to leave comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and be happy. And now I'm going to hit the stop recording button.